What's up, Professor Wergeles here. We are moving on to lecture number 13. Now, towards the beginning of the semester, I said this may be moving slowly for some people. Well, now is the time where we're starting to do some awesome stuff. We're actually going to build an app using the knowledge that we learn. We're going to use Git. We're going to keep track of versions, and we're going to keep going from here. We're going to be learning new stuff. This is important stuff to know for web development, which most jobs in the industry are either going to be doing web development or mobile app development. So this is a really good lecture to learn a real world problem. And we're going to act like we have a client, just like I do for my business. So first, let's start with these slides, building apps.pdf. Okay, I'm opening up the slides. We're going to start from the first slide, and we're going to talk about building a complete web app. Now, we learned a lot of stuff with CSS. So we went from HTML, CSS, JavaScript, then we learned jQuery. We kind of took a little sidetrack by learning Git, but it's important for this lecture so we can keep track of versions just like we would if we had a client. Now let's come back to web development. So Git and version control can be used for any programming language. Be used for web development, Java, C, any project that you're doing, you should be using Git. Now, coming back to web development, let's talk about the position property. We looked at it before. We saw that we used it with the Z index, but now let's talk more details. The position property specifies the type of positioning method used for an element. There are 5 position values. We have static, relative, fixed, absolute, and one of my favorites, sticky. Now, elements are then positioned using the top, bottom, left, and right properties. However, these properties will not work unless the position property is set first. Key thing right there. That's going to be on an exam. These properties will not work unless the position property is set first. They also work differently depending on the position value. So let's take a look at all these examples. The first one we're going to look at is static. HTML elements are positioned statically by default. Static positioned elements are not affected by top, bottom, left, and right properties. Test question right there. If I use a static position element, top, bottom, left, and right does not have an effect on it. Now, an element with position static is not positioned in any special way. It is always positioned according to the normal flow of the page. So if I don't put position static there, it's going to be put by default. So here is a position static. So I have, let's say, an H1, and I have a paragraph tag, and then I have a div. Okay, it's not positioned in any special way, and it's always positioned according to the normal flow of the page. Remember, we have inline elements and block elements. So if I have block elements, it's just one following the other all the way down. If I have inline elements, it's one next to each other as long as the browser's width has enough space. Now, what about relative? We saw this with the Z index. An element with position equal to relative is positioned relative to its normal position. Keyword normal position there. Setting the top, right, bottom, and left properties of a relatively positioned element will cause it to be adjusted away from its normal position. Other content will not be adjusted to fit in any gap left by the element. So you see here I have a div. So I have an H1, a paragraph tag, and a div. On this paragraph tag, I said position relative. That's relative to its normal position, which is right here on the previous slide. And I'm saying left 30 pixels. So from the left, move over 30 pixels. Okay, and you'll see this div is aligned in its normal flow. They're all left aligned. Over here, they're left aligned, and the div is from the left 30 pixels. So position relative is relative to its normal position. Now, what about position fixed? An element with position fixed is positioned relative to the viewport. Remember, the viewport is going to be your browser's window. So every time I load my HTML page onto the browser, it's going to be displayed and rendered in the viewport, which means it always starts in the same place even if the page is scrolled. Now, that's interesting there. And actually, on one of the challenges, this is what I was wanting you to do. So if you were to put, let's say, a logo in the bottom left or right corner of a page, and you want it to stay there even though the user is scrolling, well, then you're going to use position fixed. Now, a fixed element does not leave a gap in the page where it normally would have been located. However, relative does not have the gap adjusted. So that means relative leaves a gap, whereas fixed does not. Notice the fixed element in the lower right-hand corner. Here's the CSS. So if I say on this div, I'm going to do position fixed. In the bottom right, it's going to be 0, 0. So from the bottom, 0 pixels. From the right, 0 pixels. So it's going to be in the bottom right-hand corner. As I'm scrolling, that div will stay there no matter what. And what about absolute? Now, an element with position absolute is position relative to its nearest position ancestor, instead of position relative to the viewport like fixed. However, if an absolute position element has no positioned ancestors, it uses the document body and moves along with page scrolling. A positioned element is one whose position is anything from static. So here's an example. So here I have a div, it's position relative, and then I have another div inside of that div, so it's an ancestor, and that div has position absolute. So you'll see here, if I do, let's say, bottom 10, right 0, it will be from the bottom of the parent div, not the bottom of the page. Okay, so that's a big difference there. So absolute is its nearest positioned ancestor. And keyword positioned here. The ancestor has to be positioned, which means anything except static. If it's not positioned, the ancestor is irrelevant. In a lot of cases, position absolute and position relative will be similar. They'll act as the same. The only difference is when you have a positioned ancestor, then absolute is different. So it's a rare case, but if it has a positioned ancestor, you'll notice a difference there, which we'll take a look at in the code. So here I have a div that has position relative. You'll see then I have another div inside of it with position absolute. I have top 80. So instead of top 80 from the viewport, it's going to be top 80 from the ancestor, and it's going to be right 0 from the ancestor, not from the page. So if it was right 0 from the page, this div would be way over here, but it's actually from its ancestor. Okay, so you see I have two divs. So the outside div will be ancestor. The inside div will be the child, so it's a nested div. In this case, if I use position absolute, it'll work because the ancestor is a positioned element. Thus, the div is from the right from the parent div and from the top from the parent div, not the viewport. The last one is position equal to sticky. If an element is with position equal to sticky, it's going to be positioned based on the user's scroll position. A sticky element toggles between relative and fixed depending on the scrolled position. It is position relative until a given offset position is met in the viewport. Then it sticks in place, like position fixed. Now, the only bad thing with this is not all browsers support it. So Internet Explorer, Edge 15, and earlier versions do not support sticky positioning. Safari requires a WebKit prefix, which you'll see in the example on the next page. You must also specify at least one of top, right, bottom, and left for the sticky position to work. So here's an example. I have a sticky item here, and I'm going to start scrolling. So I scroll down. You'll see it's moving, so it's relative. I'll scroll down. It's now going to hit the top. You'll see lorem ipsum is right below. And now it sticks to the top, so it's position fixed, and lorem as well as keeps going, so it continues to stick to the top, and even when there's no elements on the page. So it first starts here. Once it hits the top, it's going to stick as a position fixed, and then it's going to stay up at the top. So I see this a lot with nav bars. I have a nav bar. Let's say it's in the middle of the screen to begin with. The user scrolls down. It goes to the top of the screen, stays there, and then the rest of the content scrolls. You'll see that commonly with nav bars. We're going to go to position.html. We're going to look at this coding exercise and take a look at all these position elements, which will then help us make our complete application in the end. So we're going to do a few practice runs, and then we'll build our complete app. So stick with Professor Wergeles, and we'll see you in the next video.